SCSS at the moment. Okay, cool. I was hoping I wasn't sort of explaining this to people that knew more than I did last time, so that's good. A few resources. The examples I'm going to show you, just to go with the slides, but the slides are going to go on SlideShare or something later. So I'll put the examples on GitHub so you can find them later once you go with it. And also the actual official website for SAS has shed loads of good documentation. So if you want to learn more later on, that's the place to go. Okay, so before we go into why you should use it, I thought I'd explain SAS and SCSS, because you've probably heard of SAS, you might not have heard of SCSS. So SAS and SCSS, pretty much the same thing. The syntax is a little bit different. The kind of the standard one now is SCSS, which stands for, I had to look it up, Sassy CSS. It does all the same stuff, but it uses the same syntax as CSS. So you use like curly brackets and you use colons. Semicolons. That's the word I was looking for. Thank you. Yeah, whereas SASS you used indentation. Okay, so why should you use it? It's really easy to learn. I'm sure all of you that are doing front-end development know probably pretty well how to use CSS. SCSS is like CSS plus a bit more. So it's really easy to learn. You can all start it today, but it makes the CSS you know a bit more powerful. You can do a bit more in it you couldn't do before. It gives it a few extra features, and those few extra features make your life that bit easier. Makes reading your CSS easier, makes writing it easier. So yeah, I think the benefits are pretty good. It takes a bit of time to kind of, the more you learn, the more you get out of the benefits. So I was speaking to Derek earlier, who's in there somewhere, he was saying that he sort of started using it, and over time it's kind of got better and better as he uses it. So good time to start today. We're going to have a look now at working with SCSS. So 4 kind of features here that are the more common ones that personally I use. Probably starting at the most common, going down to Mixins, which I use less often day to day, but it's worth knowing about. So we'll have a look at nesting, variables, partials, and mixins. They're all pretty simple, so I've got some simple little demos. Okay, so nesting, your HTML you write is already nested. Hopefully you actually use an indentation to make it look really nice and neat. It's all a hierarchy. CSS tends not to be nested now. Some people do like a tab thing to kind of indent parts of the CSS to make it easier to read, but generally it's just a file with loads and loads of CSS. It's quite hard to kind of flick through and read and find some bits of code in there. So SCSS can make your CSS into a hierarchy. That in turn allows you to write less code, and because you've written less, you can read it more easily, so it makes reading it quicker, more easy. So, see if I set this up right, I'm going to try and switch to an example. Cool. Okay, so for the examples, I've got just some random simple HTML that I wrote up. It doesn't really create anything in particular. It's kind of like some navigation stuff and some sections. Just some HTML that we can add some styles to. On the right hand side, there is a little example showing, you'll probably recognize it as basic CSS, but we've nested the different styles. So rather than having to write out nav.unordered list, so nav unordered list, nav unordered list, this item, nav unordered list, this item, we can just nest nav. We're going to give it a background color, and then that nav is going to have an unordered list inside it. We're going to give that some list style, and the list items in that are going to have some more styles. and on and on. So you can really sort of simply specify the different styles without having to write out everything all the time. And as you can see, kind of the nesting structure matches the HTML nesting structure, so everything just kind of stays nicely in sync. With the sections, we've got two sections. One has a class of main, one doesn't. So we can say that sections are going to have a border, and it's got a class of main and padding. So you can start to specify, subsets of your elements. So you can say that if it has a class on, do this. If it doesn't have a class, then don't have the styles. So hopefully that kind of is a nice little simple example. And it takes a lot of while to sort of be able to write that quickly, but once you kind of understand how the nesting works, it's really quick to add to your CSS. Now the clever bit is that if you tried to run that in a browser, it wouldn't work. But SCSS provides a really simple little command line tool that converts that into just standard CSS that you use in your actual project and the web browser understands. So when that is converted, so you convert that, you run it through the little command line tool, and it comes out something like that. It tries to maintain the nesting just so you can understand it a bit, but it strips out the SCSS stuff and replaces it with CSS stuff so the browser understands it. But that bit of CSS you never actually manually code, that's just generated for you. As you can see, this is the stuff that you kind of have to avoid writing that out all the time, and that out all the time, and that out all the time. Okay, so another of the features, benefits, are that you can use variables in your CSS. So like, most programming languages, you can define a value somewhere once, and then you can just reuse it later on in the code. Using variables means that you can actually kind of control a whole layout, a whole style, a whole theme, just from editing a few variables. You can change like your font height, you can change a few colors, and your whole theme can be completely different. I think that's kind of how some kind of WordPress themes work nowadays, is that they write your Sass, you can just go and change your variables and update your theme completely. Variables can also be used in calculations. You can run kind of color modifiers over them, and there's loads of other operations that you can do with variables. So you can actually do some clever stuff where you define a few variables, and then you can convert those into a whole range of colors, a whole range of different sizes to be used through your code. So as a quick example of that, we've got the same markup, pretty much the same SCSS, but we've added a couple of variables. So you just define a variable, at the top of your file. So we've defined a color, we've defined a size to use for some padding, and then throughout the code, you can just reuse that variable. So we can use the background color there, we can use it down here as well. So for this one, in navigation, it's going to be one color, and we can actually say, okay, so we want to use something similar to that first color, but we want it to be 5% lighter. So go and calculate that for us. We're not concerned exactly what the color is. It needs to be that bit lighter, or you can say that bit darker, or you can do a whole load of different colors as well. So that's how you can kind of build a whole theme off just a few variables. And the same with padding. We can say, like, on a section, give it 20 pixels padding. But where the section has a class of main, do that by 1.5 times, so we want 30 pixels padding. And just as an example of what that actually goes and generates, so it goes away, sticks our colour on there, and slightly changes it, and just the colour there for us. And then again, we've got 20 pixels padding, and on main, 30 pixels padding. So it can calculate all that stuff for you automatically. Okay, so partials and importing allow you to split your SCSS into some nice, neat, manageable chunks. Most of you have worked on these big CSS files that are like 1,000 lines long, thousands of lines long, and just an absolute mess to work with. Well, with some SCSS, you can split that up into as many files as you want, put them in different folders, organise them in whatever structure you want. You can also include or import various open source libraries to give you a whole load of code for free. So partials are really easy. I use these loads just to kind of keep my code organised. So really simply, you can define, show you the partials first, so you can define a variables partial, stuck up two variables in it. You can define a nav partial, which has a bit of nav code. You can define something for sections, and then later on you can bring it all together into one file just by importing each of them. At the moment I'm working on some Angular stuff. I've created some directives, and each directive has its own SCSS file in the directive, and later on I just import stuff from all the directives, bring it together into one file. When I want to go and edit something, I can just go and find the directive and edit it in the right place, rather than searching through a massive CSS file for the right bit. So it can really help sort of speed up your coding. And then when you see that's generated, again, it just creates a standard CSS file, puts it all together for you. And lastly, Mixins. I probably use these the least kind of day-to-day, but kind of use them fairly rarely. But a lot of the open source libraries do use them really heavily. So a Mixin is basically like a reusable snippet of SCSS, kind of like a function. So you can pass in variables, and it then creates some CSS for you. So you can prevent repetition with it, and there's loads of open source Mixins that you can use. So you don't actually have to dream up your own. If you're trying to work out how to do something, there's Mixins out there for you already. So this is a really simple example, and I pulled this off the SAS website because I've never actually written any of my own Mixins. I just wanted something that was simple to demonstrate. So there's a Mixin here for adding vendor prefixes to your border radius. So rather than having to write out all the vendor prefixes every time you add a border radius, you just want to write out I want a border radius, and SAS will do the vendor prefixing bit for you. So we can supply the radius, and it will then create WebKit and Mozilla and Microsoft and the standard border radius. And then to use that, you just do include border radius 5 bits. And that then generates nicely for you. So it creates that for you in your final CSS file. Nice and easy. And obviously there's other stuff SCSS does, but you can figure that out. So actually making the switch, this is I was kind of put off from using SCSS, thinking that it was going to be really difficult to learn, or like really technical to understand, or loads of stuff to install and set up. But actually once I've done it, it was like over and done with in a few minutes, and crack on from there. So to install it, depends slightly on what operating system you use, but pretty much it's just something like, I think it's like gem install SAS, bam, done. Pretty simple. There's instructions on the install page, depending on what operating system you use. And then, as SCSS is just CSS plus some more stuff, you can convert current CSS files into SCSS files. You don't have to start again. You can just switch mid-project if you want to. So I'll show you that in a second. And then the bit to actually generate your SCSS back into CSS to use in your project there's a really simple command line to run that, which I'll show you in action in a minute, but it's basically SCSS, the CSS, it should be styles.scss, so the CSS file, SCSS file, colon, and then the CSS file you want to make it to. I'll actually show you that for real, so doing it backwards. Okay, so as an example, I have delete those. Right, so here I've got, imagine this is like a project half done or one you're just starting. You've got your HTML file, that's pretty standard, and you've got your CSS, CSS, got your CSS file that you've written out or that you're starting on. And you're like, yep, I'm going to switch, I'm going to give SCSS a go, SCSS a go. So it's as simple as rename your SAS file, stick an S in front of it. Done. Stick an S in front of it, and then go to command line. Obviously, once you've installed SCSS, and all you've got to do is SCSS, and we're converting a file called styles.scss, and we want to name it styles.css. Run that, done. That will then generate for you back to your CSS file that you can include in your project. But now you get all the extra features and benefits that CSS gives you. So as you're working, you can start to add variables. You can do so you can start putting variables in. And now when you go and generate that again, it would have used that in your generated CSS that they've got in for you. But as you're working through your project now, you can start to reuse that variable. You can start to nest the code. You can start to make calculations. All the stuff that SCSS provides is now available to you. Now it's a bit of a pain having to go back and forth to your command line, regenerating it. So as an added benefit, they've given you a little watch command. So we can just run our conversion and just add watch. And now as long as that's running, every time you save your SCSS, it will generate your new CSS. So you don't have to do anything more than edit SCSS, hit save, go in the load browser, you update your code there. So actually it's kind of no more extra work than you were doing before. You get all that extra stuff that SCSS brings along. I'll show you that action quickly. So I'm going to, I don't like to zoom out everything all the time, so I'm just going to stick that under section. Make it nice and nested. Save that. You'll see it's rewritten the files there. Go back, and it's just written back out, properly in CSS. Okay, so hopefully that's given you a kind of a very brief kind of idea of what's possible in SCSS and kind of how easy it is to actually just go from your CSS using all the benefits that SCSS brings. Next thing to try really is just to go and convert your files yourself, give it a crack. Have a look at the guide online. They've got like a step-by-step guide that takes you through each of the core features, plus like documentation for everything. It's all fairly easy to understand. And once you've had a go at kind of the basics, using the nesting and the variables and the mixins, you can have a go at some of the frameworks. So there's frameworks like Compass, Bourbon, and Suzy. They might say it, I've never used it, but I believe you're going to hear some more about that tonight, which is quite exciting. So finally, Has anyone got any questions? Yes, go for it.
Why do you have to keep converting your SCSS files to a CSS file? Is it not supported outside of this?
Okay, so SCSS, like browsers can't actually understand SCSS itself. It's a CSS preprocessor, so it needs to be processed into CSS browser to use. It's not actually kind of valid for the browser. But using something like watch command, or there's like if you use like go for grunt and gulp, it can do it all for you. So you don't actually have to do anything. You don't have to do anything extra to do the conversion. You just have to sort of do a really quick setup, and then it converts it for you. It would be really cool if CSS did all the stuff SAS did.
Does it ever cock up the conversion?
Only if you make an error yourself. One really cool thing is that if you kind of try and use a variable that doesn't exist, or you kind of miss a bracket somewhere, it will tell you when it does the conversion. And if you reload the browser, the CSS that it generates actually has the error in it, and it displays it on the page. So like you see the errors straight away. Sometimes with CSS, kind of don't notice when you make mistakes because it tells you. So that's quite cool.
You're not using the console properly, you know? They almost have you warnings. I'm joking. But it's more comfort.
Yeah.
What's the benefits of SASE over less or static?
So when I did try less before I tried SAS, SCSS, and back then it was different. Now back then, less you had to use you kind of use JavaScript to convert it. So your browser would get the less file, run it through some JavaScript. The JavaScript would then kind of inject CSS. And I didn't really like when that happened. I'd rather that it created a CSS file I could just go and look at if I wanted, and it was just a CSS file. And the browser just did what it does every day. It goes and gets that CSS and uses it.
There's quite a few more features in SAS over less as well. Pretty much every feature in less is in SAS, but the reverse isn't true.
Okay, so there's even more stuff.
Yeah. Well, I agree. Less used to be client side, but now it's server side as well. So
Yeah. I mean, I haven't used less. Well, I tried it a couple of years ago, so it might be. I'm sure there's converters that do it.
You can compile less with another patch, so you don't have to.
So I mean, when I was reading briefly earlier a bit more about SAS, it said SAS can actually convert less into CSS. So they all seem to be very similar in kind of format and what's possible.
I agree. I don't think it's the one that you're using. It's more that you should be using one.
Do you have any strategies for debugging? So if you see something in Chrome Inspector that you can see the CSS file in Chrome Inspector, and you need to know where in your SCSS map.
Yes, so there are maps. I haven't. I was using them for a while, using like the Chrome Canary, like the developer kind of version, and then I found some bugs in that, and I stopped using it because it's changing all the time. So I haven't actually used it for a while, but it does actually generate maps for you. So it kind of includes the source map in your CSS, and it generates the map file there. You also need to run it through the browser to understand what the hell it's talking about, but it does generate maps for you as part of the conversion. And also, when you do the conversion, there's various options, so you can have it compress your CSS down to one line and do things like if you use like a long version of a color, it can convert to the short version if possible. It can kind of compress stuff, or it can. The default is that it. The default is that it kind of. The default is that it kind of does the indent thing. You can turn it off. You can have it on one line. There's a whole lot of options to make it the output how you like your CSS to look. It does a weird thing here where it puts the closing bracket on the same line. You have it on the next line down, which is kind of how people tend to write, I think. So it's a little bit configurable to get it to work how you want it to work.
It's possible with SAS to write a couple of hundred lines of SAS that ends up being transformed into about 10,000 lines of CSS if you don't think about what you're doing. Have you come across any tools for sort of picking that up?
I haven't. No, I haven't. I think, but obviously you can see what's been generated just by looking at the file. So if you're worrying that what you're writing might be kind of really efficient in a way, you can just have a look at the file length that's generated, and you can pick it up that way. I haven't seen anything that's kind of does that for you. There probably is something out there in there, but never found the need to look, I guess. Anything else? Cool. Get on done then.